Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Fill Up Podcast. Today, I'm really excited to have my friend here, Jeremy Taylor. Jeremy has an amazing story. I've heard a little bit about it, and I'm actually really excited today to be able to dig more into his story and to hear him share it with us. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to Jeremy.
How's it going,
Jeremy, how
Richard?
are you? I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Yeah, excited for the podcast.
Awesome. And currently now you live in Washington State, right?
I do, yeah, Gig Harbor, Washington, which is by Tacoma.
But you're a California kid by just from where you grew up and
Yep,
came
yep.
from.
Born and raised in California. We moved out. I lived there from when I was born in 1982 all the way up until 2020. Uh, we moved out of there and traveled the U.S. for 18 months, and then landed here in Washington.
Awesome, awesome. So we're all over the continent with this
Yeah,
podcast, which is exciting.
absolutely.
So really excited to have you with us today. I actually met Jeremy in a book writing retreat about a year ago now, and just really impressed with the integrity that he has and how much he cares about other human beings, and that always draws me to them when somebody's like that. So I'd love to just turn the time over to you to share your story of where you came from and what you're up to now, all the way up to the present moment.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Richard. I had a similar kind of experience with you. That that writers retreat was really cool because there was a lot of people. I felt like it was a whole room of people with amazing stories and amazing hearts and all that stuff. So
Yeah,
it's been great to get to know you a little bit. Have the privilege of getting some coaching from you and uh, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, man, my story. I'll do my best to keep it brief. I think everybody has an interesting story. One of the things with my story is I think when I was younger, I went through such a hard childhood. A lot of a lot of my childhood seemed to be like this dichotomy between like getting people to have empathy for what I was going through. And also not wanting anybody to know what I was going through. Right. So I felt like there was kind of this hole inside of me because as I share my story, you'll kind of start to see why. But um, that was a challenge for me. And it really took me getting older and realizing that no matter who you are or where you grew up, like everybody has a worst day of their life and everybody has a best day of their life. And that's kind of their barometer for how they measure everything else. Right. And so like, it's easy for me to compare my life to some other people and say like, oh, you don't know because you haven't gone through what I've gone through. But the flip side of that coin is there's 7, 8 billion people, I don't know, on this planet. And a lot of those people have had far worse days than I have. Right. So I think it's important to like keep that in perspective, and just understand that, like when you're showing empathy to other people that like their worst day is their worst day. And that's the bottom for them. And also to kind of look at it and say like, be grateful for what you did have and what was good about your childhood and what lessons that you learned or what pain you went through that helped you become who you are. Um,
hmm.
I'm a
That's
pretty
awesome.
big, yeah, thank you. I'm a big believer in order to be happy and fulfilled, you have to love yourself. And one of the biggest shifts that happened for me in my life was when I realized that in order for me to truly love myself, I had to love what created me. So that all those things that I went through that were trauma and that were really bad and that I viewed with a really negative light, I was able to kind of reframe them and learn to be grateful for them. Like I certainly wouldn't want to go through them again or wish them on anybody else, but at the same time, like they are what made me who I am. And if I love myself, I have to love those things.
Now,
Um,
when you say love what created you, are you talking about parents, God?
yeah, so I'll kind of give the 30,000 foot view. So I grew up in a household that was never really a household. Like my parents were divorced, like while my mom was pregnant with me. So I never saw my parents together. My parents were both alcoholics. They both had some pretty significant mental health issues. Um, and there was, like divorce and fighting pretty much from day one. Like all I ever knew was that my parents hated each other. I never knew them any other way. And so I lived with my mom, and like it's hard for me to remember back, and in my mind it seems like everything was going well until a certain point. But I think the older I get, the more I realize that I was just a kid and I was naive, and I didn't realize that it was kind of a shit show, for lack of a better term, from day one. And yeah, there's a lot of, trauma around, like kind of being used as a pawn between my parents and all that sort of stuff. And I think that stuff is unfortunately somewhat normal when you have, divorced parents and they both have their own challenges and all that sort of stuff. Um, things, when I look back on my life, it seems like I said, it seemed like things were going relatively well until I was like 10, 12 years old. Um, and then I really started to kind of see the cracks and everything. And I also think coincidentally, like things really did start to fall apart and get worse. Like alcoholism is kind of that way. It starts out as a way to have fun and a way to escape. And the more you do that, the worse it gets. Right. And that snowball starts to pick up momentum, and, the wheels start to come off. So when I was growing up, my mom, it's hard for me to explain this for people to understand it, but what I knew as a child was that my mom had cancer. And so like my mom would leave for cancer treatments on the weekends, and we would, stay with babysitters or, go to our grandparents' house or whatever. And everybody in the world just knew that my mom had cancer. So, I had to deal with that as a kid. From my perspective, that was my reality. So that meant, crying, laying in bed, crying, thinking my mom might not come home from this treatment, or that, someday she was going to get taken away from us, and so on and so forth. And then when I was about 12 years old, my dad started to doubt that story. And I think some other people did too. And ultimately my dad did enough digging and was able to figure out that was a lie. And that my mom didn't ever actually have cancer. There's a whole kind of backstory into, why she did that or whatever, but it was, mental health issue, and something inside of her needed that attention and that sympathy. And so my dad's solution for that was not to not to tell us like in a kind way, and kind of let us down easy, or let us figure it out for ourselves. Like he sat us down in a room and basically just laid it on us. And looking back, I can't imagine as a dad why he thought that was the right thing to do. I think there was just so much animosity between him and my mom that it was like his way of like, oh, I'm going to get her this time, like she's done. Like it was just, they were at war,
Yeah.
and my brother and I were pawns in that war.
And
Um,
probably his excuse too was, well, I'm telling the truth. Like I'm just
right.
telling it as it is.
Yeah. Somebody
Yeah.
needs to know because she's never going to tell the truth, or, whatever. So it
Yeah.
was a very cold conversation. It was very matter of fact. And I mean, my daughter's 9 right now, and I can't imagine 3 years from now her being able to wrap her head around something like that. And I certainly couldn't. My brother was only 2 years older than me. So I don't know exactly how old we were. We were somewhere between 10 and 12. And so, yeah, he just laid it on us. And I remember sitting in that room, and just the whole room kind of spinning and melting away. And just my whole sense of reality just kind of crumbled in that moment. I didn't know who to trust or what. And it was a Sunday. My dad would pick us up every other weekend. So he waited till the last minute to tell us, because he probably didn't want to have that conversation. And then he put us in the car and dropped us off at her house, and never had a conversation with her about it. And my brother and I didn't either. So for the next, I don't know, 10 years, like I kind of believed both people. I kind of believed that my mom was telling the truth, and I kind of believed that my dad was, and I didn't really know which was which. And I really just tried to bury that conversation. And um, I don't think I could process it, so I didn't. And it really wasn't until I started exploring writing a book about my story that I actually allowed myself to process it, and that was 30 years later. Um, so fast forward till I was about 14, and life just kind of kept getting worse. My mom and my stepdad went through a divorce, and we lost our house, and a lot of kind of other somewhat normal traumatic things happened. And then when I was 14, I had I was sitting in a CPR class because I was trying to get my learner's permit early, and back then if you took a CPR class, like you could get your learner's permit 6 months early. So that was like the scam that every high school kid was trying to get involved in. So I took a CPR
So
class,
you can
and
drive faster.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you could drive at 15 and a half instead of 16, because that's a great idea. Um, and I was sitting in a CPR class, and I had what I know now is a massive panic attack. But this was back in like 1995, and the internet was like $6 a minute, and my parents didn't have any money, and nobody used the internet is what I'm trying to get at. And so basically, I had a massive panic attack, and nobody knew what it was. And then um, just the way my mind works, like I didn't have one panic attack. I just kept having them over and over and over again because I kept thinking I was going to have another one. And I went from being a somewhat normal skater kid in Southern California with a good amount of friends and a really fun life outside of my home life to being locked in my bedroom like instantly. Like I left that CPR class, I locked myself in my room, and I didn't leave it for 10 months, aside from to go to a doctor and get some medication or something like that. Like I didn't tell any of my friends what happened. I didn't have like a big family or anything to tell. So it was just me alone left there trying to figure out what was happening and how to deal with it. And I don't even think like medical professionals were really super in tune with it back then. Like, um, a lot of people are kind of familiar with anxiety and panic attacks now, but back then nobody knew what it was. It took weeks going to several doctors for anybody to be able to kind of give us any information on it. And even when we got information on it, it was just like, take this pill and it'll go away. And then when it doesn't, okay, try this other one, and blah blah blah. So
So when you're going through this, Jeremy, do you remember? Do you remember what your thought process was? Like I can imagine as a teen, you're 16 years old,
no, I was 14.
14 years old.
Yeah,
Um, there must have been a lot of confusion, right? Because you had a pretty healthy life, like you said,
yeah. I would
pretty
say, I would
fun
say, and
skater.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just reiterating, pretty fun, skating with your buddies and stuff,
Yeah,
and hanging out, and lots of good friends.
yeah. I had experimented with drugs and stuff. I mean, I smoked a fair amount of weed as a kid. I drank a little bit. That was all kind of normal in my household.
Mm-hmm.
And then unfortunately, I tried LSD with a friend of mine, probably like 6 months before that panic attack. And I had always heard these stories that people do LSD and it rots their brain and they never come back. And I think there was a big part of my mind that was like afraid of that being what happened.
Oh,
Because,
so
we
then
had no,
that's the story. That becomes the story then.
yeah, it kind of became the
Yeah.
story in my mind that like, oh, I'm that guy that happened to. Right. So that was part of it. Honestly, though, I would say more than anything, it was like I was in the middle of the ocean and I was just trying not to drown. Um, I mean, it was like I would wake up, I would cry most of the day. I didn't have any tools. I didn't have anybody to talk to. I didn't know about journaling. I didn't know about meditation. I didn't know about anything other than something is really, really wrong and I don't know what to do about it. And so, yeah, that was really just it, man. I was just honestly, trying not to commit suicide was probably the reality of it. That for a long time during that period, that seemed like what was the solution. And I got to a point where I sat out on my window in the bedroom and I thought about it and I was like, maybe that's the right thing to do. Um, and again, like I said,
Sat out on your window like you're
yeah, I
high.
sat on, we had a 2-story house, so it wasn't like I was sitting on the Golden Gate Bridge, right? But I wanted to put myself in this situation where I was like, okay, I could do this. And is this really what I want to do? And I wouldn't recommend that for anybody else, but that's the point I was at in my life. And I realized that like I probably could take a nosedive off of that thing or figure out another way to do it. That was kind of just my way of getting to that edge and seeing if that was really what I wanted to do. And I think the biggest gift that I had one of my other coaches asked me one time, he's like, what kept you from doing that or from exploring that further? And I think one of the gifts that I've always had is I have this innate belief inside myself that things will always get better. And I didn't want to miss out on that. You
Mm.
know, I didn't want to, I felt like a lot of my situation was a situation I was born into. And if I could just figure out how to weather the storm until I could get out of that situation, that I could figure out the rest. And so that was kind of like my guiding light and kind of my beacon during that time was just that as soon as I'm in charge, I'll be able to figure this out. And I don't really know where that comes from. I don't know if it's a personality type thing or if it's just a
Mm.
inherent kind of grit that I have. But ultimately, that was it for me. And so I went through this cycle of every day having panic attack after panic attack. I mean, I don't think I had an hour in that 10-month period where I wasn't having a panic attack. It was just like one massive panic attack the entire time. And so I took a bunch of pills, did everything that they said to do, and then I realized that if I kept doing what they were saying, I was going to be in that room forever. Um, and I was a freshman in high school. I had missed my first semester. I'd missed half of my first semester and my second semester of high school. It was summertime, and I kind of just I've always been wired that when my back's against the wall, I just go forward. And I was like, I just have to figure out how to go back to school. Like if I'm going to feel like this in this room, I might as well feel like this out in the world. And that was like as much analysis as I did on it. I wasn't going to sit around any longer and wait for somebody else to fix me. I was like, you know, if I'm going to be miserable here, I'll be miserable there. And so literally my goal for like a month was to be able to like go out with my friends. And that started with being able to walk to the mailbox by myself. We lived in an apartment complex. And so like the mailbox is, you know, I don't know, 100 feet away or something. So then the goal was to, you know, walk around the apartment unit that we lived in. And then the goal was to walk around the apartment complex. And each one of those steps took a lot longer than I could even imagine this to this day. Like just walking to the mailbox was probably like a week to like actually pull that off. And then I just called one of my friends, or I think they called me out of the blue. And my friends had been calling, but my mom had just been telling them that I wasn't going to answer. They would come to the door. I wouldn't go down, like whatever. So at some point in time, I just gave in and I was like, and I went to the movies. And it was probably the scariest day of my life. And we can get into my story a little bit later, but I've done a lot of scary stuff, like summited Mount Rainier and done helicopter work on power lines and, you know, worked on energized power lines for 15 years every day. The scariest day of my life was probably going to the movies that day. And I remember being in that movie just terrified because nobody knew what I was going through and I couldn't let them see it, like in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I never asked for help. Like I would say, even people that know me to this day, most people don't know that I went through any of that because I was just very ashamed of it and I didn't want anybody to know about it. So fast forward, went into
I
summer school.
I
Oh,
didn't know
good.
it either, and I know part of your story.
Right.
So this is super interesting. I find it I find it fascinating too with how you describe this, that you're sitting there and nobody knew what you're going through, and you didn't want them to know what you're going through as well, because
Yeah.
of probably how painful it was, or how awkward it was. You didn't want to stick out, or not fit in, or like all those pressures of a
Yeah.
14, 15-year-old at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, man. I
Yeah.
was like, I hadn't even gone through puberty yet, right? Like I was trying to figure out the world. Like there's enough pressure in that alone. And then like I grew up in Rancho Cucamonga, California, which is an interesting town because it was like the outskirts of LA when it started. And then as it started, as like that urban sprawl started to happen, it started to get like more and more affluent.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody moved there because they wanted to get twice the house for half the money of like LA or West Covina or wherever, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of my friends had money because you know they sold their house in LA and moved to there and bought a house for half as much and had the same salary, and then their careers were advancing and all that sort of stuff that happens to families as they go through those ages, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
for me, I was very ashamed of like where we lost our house. We were on welfare. Like I was, you know, on what they called reduced lunch, right? Like because we didn't make enough money to buy regular lunch. And so I had
And
all those
your
pressures
parents
anyways.
were separated, right? From what age?
Yeah. Yeah. My parents were divorced from the time, my mom was pregnant with me. Like my dad
Okay.
was in rehab and I think there was like a last hurrah moment and like I was an accident and then like it wasn't enough to get them back together. So they were divorced before I was ever born. And then my
Okay.
mom remarried and then I went through that divorce as well, probably around that same time. Like the divorce with my mom and stepdad probably took 10 years. Like they got And my mom passed away. I think she was still married to him, but they were like officially separated for like probably the last 20 years of her life. Um,
So
but
there's some
yeah, so
foundational stuff going on in your life at this time as well. Like there's the stuff
yeah,
happening to you, the story that you made up about LSD and what was happening, as well as this foundational home life that you're living with your
yeah,
mom and your stepdad, and they're going through their struggles. And yeah,
yeah. And I was just I was trying to get to a place where I just felt sane. And on top of that, there was just the best analogy I use is like, I felt like I was in the ocean, and every time I'd come up for a breath, I'd get hit by another wave, right? Like,
mm,
um, parents would lose a job, or, something would happen. I don't know, all kinds of stuff that life kind of throws at you, right? And then all the stuff with being 14, like having girlfriends that you think are the love of your life, and then they break up with you, or,
right, yeah.
whatever, all
And
that
then
stuff
life is
on,
over, and
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
especially after the first one, right? There's where
Yeah.
you think that you'll never find
Yeah. You
somebody
never
like
be the
them,
same. Yeah.
yeah, and you'll never be the same, never be able to love anybody again that way.
Yeah. And for me, my friends and girlfriends and whoever it was, they were always like my normalcy, right? Like they were my escape. Like I could get out of my house that was constant chaos. Like my mom's mental health wasn't just about lying about cancer. It was everything was about her, and she was a severe alcoholic. And so every night was massive drama. And my escape from that was hopping on my skateboard and going to somebody's house. Like I was never at home before, I locked myself in my room. And even after that, like as soon as I got out of there, like I was never home. I never wanted to be home. Um, yeah, and like just to kind of put in perspective of like how much trauma there was during that time. Like my mom tried to commit suicide like while I was in my room, um, and I found her and laid with her the entire night, and she took a bunch of pills, and I was too ashamed to call anybody, so I just stayed there with her and prayed to God that she wouldn't stop breathing. Um, and the crazy thing about like my life when I was a kid is like when she was good, like I went back in my room and we never talked about it. I don't even know if she knows it happened. Um, I mean, she's gone now, but we never had that conversation. And like, so it was just like wave after wave after wave of stress. And for me, it was like, how do I just weather the storm, to kind of get out of this? And so I went back to school. It was equally as terrifying as that day at the movies. And for the rest of my high school career, I pretty much just fought off panic attacks by distracting myself and being around. Luckily, I had absolutely hilarious friends. Like we were kind of like that show Jackass before it existed. We were just constantly getting in trouble and being what I would call now bad kids, but like it was just what we did. And that whole skateboard community is kind of that way. Like you're just constantly causing trouble and having a good time, and ribbing each other and all that stuff. So yeah, and then graduated high school. My senior year, I had to make up for all those classes I missed when I was a freshman. So it's funny because I feel like I graduated with a 1.6 GPA. So I feel like I was the hardest working like non-graduate in the history of the world. Like I worked my butt off to get out of high school, and I think that's really where like the first like iteration of my work ethic came from. Because I never cared enough to get an A in class, but I always did what I needed to do to get a passing grade because I just wanted to graduate. I didn't. I'm I'm a fairly smart person, and I'm an Enneagram 7. If any of your listeners know about that, so
Mhm.
for me, it was like just have fun all school year and then cram at the end and get an A on the final, and that's enough to get through the class and move on to the next one. And so my senior year, I had a 0 period. I had all 6 periods. All my friends had 5 periods. I had a 0 period. I had all six, and then I had 4 classes at night. So I went to school from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. 5 days a week for my whole senior year, just
Wow.
just to be able to graduate. Um, and so like even though I graduated with a 1.6, and I think that's funny now, uh, it was something I was very proud of because I worked my butt off to do it. And then I immediately moved out of my house when I graduated at 17. I moved out I think maybe 2 months after I graduated. Um, Thought I was going to be an entrepreneur. I got involved with a multi-level marketing company, and I moved out and signed a lease on an apartment and started working, and I did really well as far as like sales and metrics go, but the company that I worked for went out of business, and so I never got paid. I worked there for probably 6 or 8 months, and
Mhm.
the check was always in the mail, and I was young and naive, and I just kept grinding away, and they're giving me awards for, all these accomplishments, but I never got paid. And so, make a long story short, I got evicted from the apartment, and I ran up a bunch of credit cards and had all this debt, and I moved in with my dad for the first time in my life, because I didn't want to move back in with my mom. Um, and my mom and I weren't really talking at that point in time. We never had the hard conversations that we need to have. I just kind of determined that we weren't ever going to have any conversations, and
Mhm.
luckily that didn't last forever. But that's where I was at then. I moved in with my dad, and uh, kind of decided, okay, like I'm not going to do the entrepreneur thing. I'm just going to get a job. And so I was like, what's the best job I can get with where I'm at? I don't want to go to college. I don't want to be a lawyer or a doctor or something like that. So I had some buddies that were in the power line industry, and I knew you could make a lot of money if you were willing to work hard and sacrifice. And I knew I could do all those things. So yeah, I spent 4 years trying to get into that industry. I became a residential electrician. During that process, I didn't think I was ever going to get into the power line industry. So I actually started my own business, which is funny. I said I didn't want to be an entrepreneur, but I've kind of always had that in me.
Yeah.
And so I started my own electrical company, had no idea what I was doing, didn't even have a license. I was just working and just kind of taking one step, putting one thing in front of the other. And yeah, within like a 4 year period, I started going to school to take all these electrical classes so I could get into, like, the first time I applied for the electrical apprenticeship, they basically looked at my residential experience and they were like, that's what you should do. You're not cut out to be a lineman. So all of that work that I had done for like 2.5 years up to that point basically hurt me. Like, if I had walked in there without any of that, they probably would have taken me. But because of that, they're like, no, that
Mhm.
like that industry just has a really like competitive
Mhm.
nature between different trades and stuff. And especially at that time when they weren't hiring very many people. This was back in like 2003. Um, so basically I was like, okay, what could I do to get another interview and for you not to be able to say no? And they gave me a list of things that you could do. And they're like, if you do any of
Mhm.
these things, it'll help you. So I decided I was going to do all of them. So I took all these electrical classes. I got my Class A license. I got some experience working for a power line company, like in their yard, just delivering material and stuff. So, um, yeah, so basically I walked it back into that interview a year and a half later, and I was like, last time I was here, you told me if I did any of these things that would help. I did all of them.
Mhm.
And they accepted me, and that kind of started my career. And so I went, uh, that was
How,
like I felt
how
like my
old are you at
first,
this time?
uh, 23, I think.
23. Okay.
23
Yeah.
when I was accepted. Yeah. Um, so that was like that's what really changed everything in my life. I felt like it was my first big break, even though it wasn't really a break.
Mhm.
I kind of forced their decision, but it was the first time that like I had really tried for something and it worked out. And the power line industry is really well paying even from the beginning. So I went from making like 20 grand a year to making 90 plus, like overnight. And I was 23. So obviously I made some mistakes
Yeah.
there, bought a fancy car and, all that sort of stuff. But that industry really changed everything about me. I feel like that industry was like the
Mhm.
dad that I didn't have. And so like the work ethic that I thought was great, I realized wasn't what it was to them in that industry. I'm biased, but I think it's the hardest working industry that there is. And I got thrown into that fire, and I didn't have anywhere else to fall back on. So I just had to become what that industry required me to become, which was the hardest working human
Mhm.
being I could imagine being.
Mhm.
And so, yeah. Fast forward to 4 years after that, I became a journeyman lineman, and then uh, I had some interest in becoming a foreman. Like for me, when I got into that industry, I got into it to run a company because that's what I was doing on a really small scale before that, and that's just really my drive has always been to kind of constantly be climbing and evolving. And so in the process of that, I really fell in love with being a lineman, which wasn't the plan, but I'm super grateful that it happened. And I absolutely love that job. So I decided not to take a management position immediately. I wanted to kind of season myself and kind of earn some respect in my peers and all that sort of stuff. So about 2.5 years after I became a lineman, I became a foreman, and then I went back to being a lineman, and then back to a foreman a couple times, and then um, somewhere around 2016. Well, I had a daughter. My wife and I got married along the process of that. I've been with my wife for 20 years now. We've been married for 15. She was with me before I became an apprentice lineman,
Wow.
and so yeah, I know she's in it for the right reasons. I actually lived in her house with her with her parents when I got accepted into the apprenticeship, and so we had a daughter in 2014, and then I just, as a lineman, you're just working insane hours and, spending 4 hours a day on the freeway in Southern California, and then working 10, 12 or more hours a day. So I was working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, plus, another 20 hours of drive time. And it was great. Like we bought a house, remodeled it, sold it, bought another house, put a pool in. Like we had a really, what most people would say was a perfect life career wise. But I worked a ton of nights, and when my daughter was born, I agreed to not work weekends. I had always worked weekends before that. Most linemen pretty much work 7 days a week until they take vacation, and then they disappear for a month or two, and then they come back and work 7 days a week again. And some guys work 7 days a week forever and just take a random day off here and there. And I was kind of the latter of those two. Like I always said I was going to go take a vacation. Maybe I'd take a week here and there, but for the most part, just work 7 days a week. Linemen worked 32-hour shifts, and not like firemen where you sleep half of that. Like linemen, you go in your truck, you leave the yard, you don't come back for 32 hours. You might catch an hour nap here and there, but sometimes not at all. Um, and
Wow.
um, yeah, when my daughter was like 2 years old, and she would stand on the front porch and cry when I would go to work at nights, because when she was born, I said I'm not going to work any more weekends. I said you can have me for whatever you want during the week, but I'm not going to work any weekends. So I still averaged like 60 hours a week. It was just all nights and days and long shifts and all that sort of stuff. And um, then ultimately I was like, I'm not going to do that anymore either. She'd be sitting on the porch crying, and and I knew in the back of my mind that as a power lineman, every time you leave, even just driving on the freeway, like there's a chance you don't come home. But then on top of that, like the dangers of the job, and I have buddies, that got really injured or passed away from our trade. And it just once I had a daughter, it wasn't about me anymore, and I was always okay with that reality, because I don't know, I just figured life will work out however it works out, and I didn't really worry about it. But when I had a daughter, I really started to think about that. So I took a job in the office, and um, yeah, I was able to be at home every day, take my daughter to school, all that sort of stuff. And then that kind of spurred me to realizing in my mind that, okay, like, uh, financially, I told my wife, I said, financially, I need to put us in a position where when they say I got to go back to the field, because everything in the power line industry is temporary. It just is. That's just the nature of the job. And I knew the job that I had was temporary. And at some point in time, I was going to have to go back into the field. And as much as I would like that from a personal enjoyment standpoint for my family, I knew it wasn't the right thing to do. So that's where my entrepreneurial career kind of restarted. And we started buying real estate investments and started a business. And,
So
you
this is
know,
2016 ish, right around
2020 was when, so
2020.
yeah, there
Okay.
was probably like a 2 or 3 year period where I was in that job and getting really good at it, and, really proud of it and all that sort of stuff. And then the seeds started to go in my mind that, man, I really like doing this. I don't really like, I didn't really like the job itself, but I loved all the ancillary benefits from it. It was like the
Hmm.
opposite of being a lineman. Being a lineman, I loved every day at work, but I didn't have time to do anything else, including be much of a dad. And so,
Right.
yeah. Um, so that's kind of the personal career. Now I'm an entrepreneur. I just left that job 2 days ago. I
Hmm.
was able to kind of juggle all those balls for like 4 years, and put us in a position where we replaced our income, um, and had some pretty big wins in real estate and in businesses. And um, yeah, just we basically accomplished that goal that I told my wife, which was, look, I got to put us in a position where when they say I got to come back to the office, I can say no. And you know, 2 months ago they said I got to come back in the office, and I said no.
Mm,
Um, and so that was a big win. The other thing to kind of back up for, to go back to the anxiety part is, um, so my career was doing the trajectory that I just told you about, but on the backside of that, or on the inside of that, inside of me, there was still this anxiety and depression and ADD and whatever diagnosis a doctor would give me when I went in there and I told him, look, I'm doing all this stuff in my life, but I'm not happy inside. I'm not fulfilled inside. And so I would say like every 3 or 4 years, I would go through this cycle of like, man, I gotta do something to like become happy. And I would go see a doctor. I would get on the pill program, and then it wouldn't work. And I would do the same thing I did when I was 14 and flush the medicine down the toilet and just grit my way through it. And so I did that several times. I even went to the Amen clinics and had my brain scanned and got all this like
mm,
what I consider like the top of Western medicine's solutions for all these problems of why I was broken and all this stuff. And ultimately, during that time, I was a foreman. I had a lot of responsibility on my plate. I had guys and their livelihoods and their lives, in my hands every day at my job. And um, I had the doctor that I had that I thought was like the best doctor in the world, basically just turned out to be like any other doctor and just threw pills at me until hopefully one of them worked. And
mm,
if they didn't, he didn't really care. He was doing what he could do or whatever. And so I had a moment in 2015, I think, uh, where I was a foreman and they switched some medication up on me. And in hindsight, I know I got really bad advice from that doctor, but I just trusted him, and I stopped taking the medication I was taking and started taking another one. And it just went really bad. And I was pretty much right back in that room like I was when I was 14. The only difference this time was I had a mortgage and a family and a crew and all
mm,
this stuff. So I couldn't lock myself in my room. Um, so I literally I would just go to work and try to get the guys as lined out as I could. And I would drive my truck around the corner and I would just break down crying. I'd call my wife. I'd try to figure out what I'm going to do. And then I would piece myself back together and I'd go finish the day or go as far as I could and make sure that everything was on track. And then so I was doing that for a while the medication was kind of getting out of my system. I was going through like withdrawals. And so I could kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel because I'd felt stuff like that before. And I felt like I would get through it. And during that process, my mom passed away.
mm,
Um, so I was already like just hanging on by a thread. And then I got a call from my grandpa in the middle of the day at work. And I was like, oh man, that's nice. My grandpa's calling me because he's like my hero, but he never called me. I didn't talk to him very much. So I knew it was weird. And ultimately, that's why he called to tell me that my mom had passed away the night before. And so like my mental health and world just kind of imploded. And I was able to get through it. I was able to deal with it. And when I kind of, a month or two later, when I kind of came out on the other side of it, I kind of had another one of those moments where I just was sitting there and I was like, enough is enough, right? Like, and what really happened, what really like clicked for me in my mind is I was thinking about my daughter and I was like, what am I going to do if she comes to me and says, Dad, I have these feelings and I don't know what to do, right? Because up until that point, I had always just gotten through everything with grit. I would reach out for help, and when it didn't work, I would lean back on my grit and I would just get through it. And I knew
mm,
I could do that for the rest of my life. I'd always like I would have moments where I wanted to like improve and get better or make the anxiety go away or not be depressed or whatever, but I always knew that if it didn't work, I could just grit through it. And when I thought about telling my daughter that like grit is what you're going to need to do, I was like there's no way that can be the answer. So it kind of triggered something in me where I was like, I have to figure out like what is the actual answer. If Western medicine isn't going to solve this problem for me, like I'm not going to give up. So then I really started looking into, um, just other avenues of it, right? I'm a big reader and researcher and, you know, uh, lifelong learner. So I just started trying to look into like what other things could I do. Started learning to meditate, learning to visualize, learning to, try to reframe my thinking into more positive thinking. And then that has been like a constant evolution ever since. Honestly, it's how I ended up meeting you, Richard, because
Hmm.
I'm night and day better than I was then, but I always want to get better than I am now, if that makes sense. So even at this point now, like
Yeah.
I feel like I'm so much stronger and I have so many more tools, but I'm constantly looking for another way to be a little bit happier or a little bit more productive or be a better dad or whatever. And I think that I'm rambling a bit here, so I'll wrap it up, but I think that comes from my childhood of always wanting to get out of the house and wanting to get on my own and take responsibility. And if I could sum it all up in that moment, what I realized was it's no, like my mental health and my happiness is nobody's responsibility but mine. And in our society, doctors want to convince you that you're broken so they can sell you a cure.
Hmm.
It's like a car dealer selling you a
Hmm.
warranty, right? Like if we can convince you that you're broken, no matter how we convince you of that, then coincidentally we can sell you this cure that we have, right? And so there's these commercials on TV, and there's all these people out there that want to convince you that you're broken, and there's a $1 billion business built around it. But and I think that works for some people, but for me, when I realized that didn't work for me, I realized the only solution left was taking accountability for my own happiness. And for me, that was really what shifted everything in my life, was when I realized that it's not a doctor's responsibility, it's not my parents' responsibility, it's not Richard's responsibility, it's mine. And so I'm going to do everything that I can. I quit drinking. I really focus on my health. I do all the things that I need to do. And when I don't do those things, I don't blame anybody but myself. Um, and I don't say blame like I beat myself up over it. I say blame like I hold myself accountable.
Hmm.
Um, if I
You
don't
made
feel
the
good,
choice.
yeah,
Yeah.
if I don't feel good, I make the choice to either do what I do to make myself feel better, or I accept that I'm not going to, and this is the result of it.
Yeah. That's awesome. What a story. We might have to have you on again
Right.
and dig
That's
into
why
more
this is
of
gonna be hard
this.
to cut. It's gonna be hard to cut you short.
um, I one of the things that I loved that you talked about in your story is dialing all the way back to the 1.6 in high school,
Mm,
and how you said I was proud of that. I'm guessing
right.
it's on a 4.0 system,
Right.
so 1.6 is what, a D
Yeah,
plus or something.
it's below graduating, but I just took
Yeah,
enough I took
but
enough
you're
classes to make up for it.
and with this being the fill up podcast, right? Fall in love with the process. That just embodies that, just that, to be proud of the work that you put in, proud of what you did, and then also at the end taking 100% responsibility for your life is that's the key. It is the foundational principle, number one success principle that Jack Canfield puts out in his book, The Success Principles, and so foundational. Like as a coach, I see it over and over again, and I see that in you as well, which is one of the reasons why maybe I like you as much as I do, is because
I
you
appreciate that.
take that responsibility.
Yeah, I
Jeremy.
appreciate that. I think it's the biggest thing, whether you're talking about your mental health or wanting to be a better dad or wanting to, be a millionaire or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish that you can't quite figure out how to do. I think so many people in society are waiting for somebody to come and give them the answer or hold their hand or whatever. Like when you talk about like wealth specifically, like there's a million courses out there that people pay for because they think that person is going to take them to the finish line, and then when they
Mm-hmm.
realize they're not, they leave and they go join another
Yeah.
course, right? And you know it's one of the things I love about wealth building is it's so similar to mental health or physical health, or it's all the same process, right? And it all starts with taking responsibility for it and understanding that you have to do the work, whether that's on your emotional status, on your mental health, or in your business, or in your career, or whatever, in your marriage, whatever it is. Like it
Mm.
starts with you.
Wow. Powerful. All right, you've already given us a lot of gold nuggets today. But if you were to give advice to people listening to this, like one powerful piece of advice that you'd offer about life or anything, what would you say?
Yeah, I would say I'm probably going to repeat myself a little bit, but I think one of the beautiful things about taking responsibility for your own life is um, not only is it the best decision you can make, but it's actually the only decision you can make,
Yeah.
right? Like it's yeah, I said it, but I'm trying to like say it in a way that it'll really land for people because that was what I realized for me is not only was it what I needed to do, like not only was it the best thing to do, but when I look back on it, I'm like, it's the only thing that worked, right? And like just that, just that moment where you know that like, okay, this is my responsibility, and the success is going to fall on me, and all I have to do is do the work, right? Like there's a million books out there that will tell you what you need to do, but you have to do what they say. You have to read the book. You have to do what they say, right? And then you have to maybe find another book that fills in
Proper
the holes,
application. Yeah,
right?
that's right. And
Yeah,
more and more knowledge so that it fits with your
yeah,
sequence. Yeah.
yeah. And
Yeah.
if the book doesn't do it, you hire a coach or you reach out for help and you talk to somebody. I think that I would say that, and then the other side of it is like that anybody that's out there, like you're not alone, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's lots of people that have been through it. Like I felt very much alone when I was 14, and because of that, I don't reach out for help as much as I probably should, even to this day.
Hmm.
And even if it's somebody to just listen to you, to just hear you pour your heart out and explain how you're feeling, like it's immensely helpful. And we live in an amazing time. Like there's a lot of negatives about social media and all the stuff that's in our world right now that's really hard to deal with, but we also have access to like unbelievably helpful people. Like they're right there in front of you. And I would say just take the responsibility and get the help that you need, and first and foremost, like start helping yourself. Do the things that you need to do. If you drink to get away from your stress and it makes your stress worse, like you might just have to face the stress without the alcohol to know how to deal with it. Because, or if you get on social media every time you start to feel bad about yourself, and it temporarily makes you feel better, but the next day you feel worse, like understand that that's your responsibility. Like nobody's going to come take your phone away. You got to do it.
I love it. Jeremy, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your story and the wisdom and the advice.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
I'm excited to I'm excited for those who get a chance to listen to this. I think it'll be awesome, and it sounds like we'll definitely have to have a sequel to this at some point, and maybe when we get our books finally written, we can talk about our books on the podcast. And
That's another
so,
story for another day.
yeah, for another day.
Yeah.
Awesome. We'll
Thanks,
see
Richard. I
everybody
really
on the next.
appreciate the opportunity, and I hope it helps somebody that listens to it.
Awesome. I'm sure it will.